Hello. So today we are going to be talking about indirect object pronouns in Spanish. So before we even get into indirect object pronouns, we need to know what is an indirect object. So an indirect object refers to whom or what, or for whom or what an action is done. Therefore, the indirect object is going to respond to the question of for whom or what, or to whom or what, right? So in a sentence, we identify the indirect object by asking these questions, okay? But pay attention. The indirect object receives the direct object. This means that in order for there to be an indirect object, you need to have a direct object. So if you haven't mastered direct object pronouns or direct objects, then you need to understand direct objects first before you can understand indirect objects. And as we know, the direct object is going to be the person or thing that receives the action, and it answers the question of who or what receives the action. Okay? So that would be the direct. And like the direct, the indirect object pronoun is going to replace an indirect object, right? So that we can avoid repetition and we can shorten the language. So let me give you an example. Compré este coche para mi padre. I bought this car for my father. So first we identify the direct object. Direct object is going to be what receives the action. So what was bought? Este coche. This car. So this car is going to be the direct object. And remember, the indirect object is going to be for whom. So who is going to receive the direct object, which is this car? My father. Para mi padre. Right? So para mi padre would be the indirect object. Okay? And in English, we will shorten that by saying, I bought the car for him. This car for him. So that's what I'm going to show you now, how to say, how would we express that in Spanish, right? But what I should also mention is that we will be only focusing on indirect objects. So obviously you're going to have direct objects, but we will not be replacing those with direct object pronouns. We will be focusing on the indirect object, okay? So yeah. Now let's look at the different types, not the different types, the different of the indirect object pronouns in Spanish. And what you would notice is that they're very similar to the direct objects, but obviously there's a difference in meaning, and the third person would be different, right? But let's go. So the black is going to represent the Spanish, what the indirect object pronoun would be in Spanish. The green would represent what it would replace in Spanish, and the red would represent the English translation of the indirect object pronoun, right? So me would replace a or para mí. And you know, of course, a and para will be to or for, because that's the question that it's responding to, right? So a or para mí, meaning to or for me. Te replaces a or para ti, meaning to or for you. Le replaces a or para él, ella, or usted, meaning to or for him, her, it, or you. So when it comes to the third person, there's a lot of ambiguity, right? Nos replaces a or para nosotros or nosotras, meaning to or for us. Os, a or para vosotros or vosotras, of course, if this is only used in Spain. To or for you all. And les, a or para ellos, ellas, or ustedes would mean to or for them or you all. So these are the indirect object pronouns in Spanish. Okay? And Just like direct objects, you do not use these with prepositions. So I cannot say estoy, not estoy. I cannot say este regalo es para ti to say this gift is for you. No, I would say este regalo es para ti. This gift is for you. That's how I would express that in Spanish. So we do not use indirect object pronouns with prepositions, right? So we now need to know where the indirect object occurs within a sentence, and it's pretty much going to be the same thing as the direct object, pretty much, right? So the first place it can occur is before the conjugated verb, right? So ella cocinó la comida para su hija. So first thing we need to identify is the direct object. So what did she cook? Food, la comida. So la comida would be our direct object. But for whom would be the indirect. So para su hija. Para su hija would be the indirect object, right? Because the daughter is the person who is receiving the direct object, which is food, right? So para su hija would correspond to le, because we would say that would be para ella, right? So le would be the appropriate indirect object pronoun, right? So we put that before the conjugated verb, so it becomes ella le cocinó la comida. She cooked food for her. Okay? So that would be the first place it can occur. If we want to make it negative, we would say ella no le cocinó la comida. So the le would go before the conjugated verb but after the no. So ella no le cocinó la comida. 2. Attached to the infinitive. So quiero dar un abrazo a los niños. So again, we identify our direct object. Quiero dar un abrazo. So I want to give what? Right? Un abrazo. That's the direct object. I give a hug to whom? To whom? A los niños. To the children. So that would be our indirect object. Okay? Because the children are going to be receiving the direct object, which is the hug. Right? So that will correspond to les. Right? And we put it attached to the infinitive, right? So quiero darles un abrazo. I want to give them a hug. Or I want to give a hug to them. But we would say I want to give them a hug. We would say I want to give them a hug. That's what we would say, right? Of course, you can also put the indirect object pronoun before the conjugated verb. So you could say les quiero dar un abrazo. And that's perfectly fine. Same thing as saying quiero darles un abrazo. Just a matter of preference, of course. 3. Attached to the gerund. So, estoy mandando una carta a ti. So, what am I sending? Una carta, a letter. That's our direct object. To who? To whom? A ti. Right? So, a ti will correspond, the appropriate indirect object pronoun to replace a ti would be te, right? So in this case, we attached it to the gerund. And as you know, the gerund will be the continuous form, right? So just like the direct object pronoun, when you attach the indirect object pronoun to the gerund, and when you attach the indirect object pronoun to the gerund, you have to put an accent on the third vowel from the end, right? Therefore, estoy mandándote una carta. Una carta. So we count 1, 2, 3, accent. We can also say, te estoy mandando una carta. So we can put the indirect object before the conjugative verb. Perfectly fine. It's just a matter of preference. But you would also realize that the translation is pretty much the same. But you would realize the difference in the Spanish would be that the second one is shorter than the first. Because to say a ti, that's two words, and te is one. So you're shortening the language by saying te. Even though in English it has the same translation, right? So yeah. Just remember, like the direct object pronouns, if you attach the indirect object to the gerund, you have to put an accent on the third vowel from the end. Okay? And 4, attach to the affirmative command. So, diga a Maria. Tell Maria. So we could now this is important, right? You would be asking, you know, what's the direct object? We'll get to that shortly. Diga a Maria. So we would shorten that by saying tell her. And how would we do that? Dígale. Because a Maria would apply the third person singular indirect object pronoun would apply. Okay? So the rule here again would be once you attach the indirect object to the affirmative command and it results in 3 or more syllables, then you have to put an accent on the third vowel from the end. So here, 1, 2, 3, accent. Dígale. If I wanted to make this negative, I would say no le diga. Right? Do not tell her. Okay, so the indirect object pronoun would go before the conjugated verb in the negative. Now, once again, you would have asked me, I'm sure you're asking me, what's the direct object? I don't see a direct object. And I would have told you in the beginning that in order to have an indirect object, you need to have a direct object. Yes. Because if I say tell Maria, I have to tell Maria something. So the direct object is implied. You see what I mean? It is implied here. You have to tell Maria something you have to tell her something. That something is going to be our direct object. Even though it is not explicitly stated, right? You have to tell her something. So in this case, the direct object is implied. So sometimes with some verbs, the direct object is going to be implied. It's not always going to be stated explicitly, right? So let me give you another example. If I wanted to say I write them, meaning that I'm writing or I'm writing to them or something like that, I didn't mention what the direct object is, but I would have to use the indirect object pronoun and say les escribo, right? I write to them, or I'm writing to them. Because you cannot write to write someone. You have to write something to someone. You understand what I'm saying? So the person has to receive whatever it is that you're writing, even though I did not state what it is that I'm writing. So that's another example, right? So it is implied that I'm writing something. So les escribo, I write to them, right? So just bear that in mind. Sometimes the direct object is going to be implied. All right. Now, let's go back to number 2. When I say quiero dar un abrazo a los niños. Now, let's say I didn't mention a los niños. Let's say I did not mention who was going to be the recipient of the hug. How would I know if I just say quiero darles un abrazo, how would I know who is the indirect object? Because les could refer to les could refer to ellos, ellas, or ustedes. So how would I know? Right. So this is the case now where you see the redundancy, right? So sometimes you're going to see a sentence whereby the indirect object pronoun is used with the indirect object, right? But that is to prevent that's to prevent that's to disambiguate the sentence and make it clear who is the indirect object. Because check it, like I said, if I were to just say quiero darles un abrazo, if I did not mention the persons before, then the person would have no clue who am I referring to, right? So in that case, I would say quiero darles un abrazo a los niños. So I would put the indirect object at the end, just for clarity, just so that there is no confusion as to who is going to be the recipient. Okay? So and then give you another example. If I say le doy $5, but to whom? Le could refer to él, ella, usted. Who are you talking about? Who do you give $5 to? But if it's not understood who is the recipient or who's the indirect object, then we need to make that clear. So what would I do? I would add it at the end. So le doy $5 a Maria. So I give Maria $5, right? So that's something you have to bear in mind when it comes to indirect objects, right? Well, indirect object pronouns, right? And in the definition, I would have said what, to what or for what. So lots of people may say the indirect object seems to only apply to a person, so only a person can be the indirect object. No. Let me show you this example. Mi madre añadió azúcar a la sopa. My mother added sugar to the soup. So what's our direct object? What did she add? Azúcar, sugar. So that's our direct object. To what? A la sopa. To the soup. So the soup is the recipient. The soup receives the sugar. So we would, in that case, we would replace that by saying, we would change that up by saying, mi madre le añadió azúcar. My mother added sugar to it. You see? So the indirect object can be a person or it can be a thing. Okay? So this is basically it for indirect objects. I know this is a bit difficult, so you'll have to probably watch this a couple times in order to fully grasp it. But we will test ourselves and see how much we understand. So it's time to test our understanding, okay? So what we are doing is that we're replacing the indirect object. Remember that we're replacing the indirect object and not the direct object, right? So we have to replace the indirect object with the appropriate indirect object pronoun, right? So yes, that's what we're doing. Okay, so the first thing we need to do is to identify the direct object so that we would know what's the indirect object, because the indirect object is going to receive the direct object. Okay, so let's go. 1. Tengo que contar la historia a Jorge. So I have to tell the story to Jorge, or I have to tell Jorge the story. So what do I have to tell? La historia. So la historia will be our direct object. To whom? A Jorge. To Jorge, right? So let me translate first and say, I have to tell the story to or here, right? So that is our indirect, and the appropriate indirect object pronoun would be le. So because we have an infinitive, you know there are two places that the indirect object pronoun can occur, right? So le tengo que contar la historia, or tengo que contarle la historia. So I have to tell him the story, or I have to tell the story to him. Same thing, right? Right, I have to tell him the story. Okay? Two. Let me just form this a little part better. Right? Okay, right. So, mis padres compraron una bicicleta para mí. My parents bought a bicycle for me. What did they buy? Una bicicleta. That's our direct object. For whom? Me. So para mí is our indirect. And of course, the appropriate indirect object pronoun would be me. So my parents bought a bicycle for me. Alright, and in this case, the indirect object pronoun will go before the conjugated verb. That's the only place it can occur here. So, mis padres me compraron una bicicleta. Right? So, my parents bought a bicycle for me, but this is shortening it up. But it bought me a bicycle. 3. Ella no quiere mostrar las imágenes a sus alumnos. She does not want to show the images to her children, to her students, sorry. Okay? So, what does she not want to show? Las imágenes, so that is the direct. To whom? A sus alumnos. And that is plural and the third person, so that would be les. And because we have an infinitive, there are two places that the indirect object pronoun can occur. Okay? So, ella, let me translate it first. So, she does not want to show the images to her students. So ella no les quiere mostrar las imágenes. Or ella no quiere mostrarles las imágenes. And this means she does not want to show them, meaning the students, the images. So you see why it's important to include the indirect object sometimes because it would clear up any ambiguity and it would clarify who is receiving the action, the direct object. Okay? So that would make it clear. So like I said, because we're going to assume that we already know, let's assume we already know who is the recipient. So we wouldn't put the indirect object. But if it's not clear, you should put it, right? 4. Mi novia trajo una torta para su hermana, right? So this is saying that my girlfriend brought a cake for her sister. So what did she bring? Una torta, a cake. That's our direct object. For whom? Para su hermana, for her sister. So that's our indirect object, right? And the indirect object pronoun would be le. So my girlfriend brought a cake for her sister. So the only place this can go is before the conjugated verb. So mi novia le trajo una torta, right? So my girlfriend brought her a cake, right? Or you could say my girlfriend bought a cake for her. Both can work, right? But I bought her a cake, right? Both of these can work. My girlfriend bought her a cake, or my girlfriend bought a cake for her. Same thing, same thing. All right, and 5, estás grabando videos para tus alumnos. So what is being recorded? Videos. So that is the direct object. For whom? Para tus alumnos. For your students. And because students are plural, and it will be third person, it will be les, right? So les. Since you have a gerund, there are 2 places, of course, that the indirect object pronoun can occur, right? So are you recording videos for your students? So let's put the first place before the conjugated verb, of course. Les estás grabando videos, or estás grabando les. Remember, so the indirect object pronoun can go attached to the gerund, but if you do that, you have to put an accent on the third vowel from the end. So here, 1, 2, 3. Estás grabando les videos. Are you recording in videos for them? Right? Okay. Right. For your students. Right. So these would be the answers, right? And my answer to this question is C. Les estoy grabando videos. So I hope that this was helpful. Gracias por ver y como siempre, hasta luego.